The air in the Hurtgen forest was less a fluid and more a thick, chilled soup of pine decay and gunpowder smoke. It was late autumn 1944, and Sergeant Major Caleb Scrap Hayes, a man whose hands were more accustomed to the wrench and the wiring diagram than the bolt of an M1 Garand, felt the cold burrow deep into the marrow of his bones. His designation in the 28th Infantry Division was nominally as an ordnance specialist, but his real job, the one he excelled at, was improvising, fixing what was unfixable, scavenging the forgotten, and making the impossible work. They were dug in near Wassenack, a small battered village that had become a meat grinder of a crossroads. The American lines here were brittle, stressed by relentless German counterattacks and a topography that favored the defender. The ground was an unforgiving landscape of trenches hastily carved into frozen earth, connected by muddy tracks that were more like open wounds in the forest floor. Caleb was huddled in a reinforced dugout, the rhythmic thud of distant artillery his constant companion. He wasn't on guard duty. His focus was on a bizarre assembly of metal parts spread out on a tarp, a salvaged M2 flamethrower fuel tank, dented and smelling faintly of hydraulic fluid, a corroded section of plumbing pipe, a pressure regulator from a wrecked Jeep, and a handful of ignition mechanisms cannibalized from German Flammenwerfer units. This was the Junkyard flamethrower, his obsession, still tinkering with that fire-spitter scrap. Corporal Finn O'Malley, a wiry, perpetually anxious scout from Boston, ducked into the dugout, shaking a drizzle of rain from his helmet. Caleb looked up, wiping grease from his forehead with a mud-caked sleeve. "Finn, you know this M2 has an effective range of maybe 30 yards tops. The Krauts are using their new thickeners. Ours burns out before it hits the objective. I'm trying to make a hybrid. Better fuel mixture, a narrower, higher pressure nozzle, and a firing pin that won't jam every 10 seconds. Something that spits true fire, not just a sputtering cough." Finn shivered and lit a cigarette, cupping the match against the damp. "Well, hurry up, Sarge. Command says the Krauts are massing north of our position near the old timber mill. They're expecting a push before dawn. Word is they brought in a special unit, Sonderkommando something quiet." Caleb frowned, the word quiet jarring him more than artillery. "Quiet? What does that mean?" "That's the mystery, ain't it?" Finn leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, the sound immediately absorbed by the dense atmosphere. "For the last 3 nights, patrols have gone out towards that mill, and nothing comes back. No screams, no shots, no sign of a struggle. Just silence. The radio signals cut out. The trip flares stay dark, like they walked into a vacuum. We found Sergeant Davies' rifle yesterday, still loaded, still clean, leaning against a stump, untouched. His pack, his helmet, gone." A shiver of genuine dread ran down Caleb's spine, a feeling far removed from the physical cold. A firefight, no matter how brutal, made sense. This selective, silent disappearance reeked of something planned, something cold-bloodedly efficient. It didn't feel like a standard infantry skirmish. It felt like a hunter eliminating prey without a sound. Did command say anything about footprints, drag marks? Caleb asked, his focus now split between his makeshift weapon and Finn's unsettling report. Nothing conclusive. Just a few sets of boot prints that don't look like ours. Too clean. And the scariest part, Scrap? The snow was falling lightly last. There were places where a man should have left a print, entering a clearing, passing a tree, but there was nothing. It was like they floated. Caleb picked up the flamethrower's wand, its steel body heavy and reassuring, and the official word was that the German troops were suffering from low morale and supply shortages, but the reality on the ground are different. He had seen the fanaticism in the eyes of the captured German youngsters and the ruthless efficiency of their veteran squad. Now this new detail about a quiet unit that vanished patrols without a trace introduced a sickening layer of psychological warfare. A silent hunter. If they can move without sound, without leaving tracks, a rifle won't stop them until they're right on top of it. We need a deterrent that covers an area, something that doesn't rely on line of sight and pinpoint accuracy. He tightened a wrench on the connection between the fuel hose and the pressure tank, his mind racing. The standard M2 was a close-quarters bunker buster, a heavy, unwieldy tool. His Junkyard model had to be more, a desperate last resort against an enemy that felt increasingly spectral. He looked at the odd assortment of parts, particularly the German igniter mechanism, a small, finely crafted brass piece. Why would a patrol simply leave a loaded rifle? Why no blood, no struggle? This silence was a weapon in itself, designed to chew at their resolve, to turn the men against the very shadow. The mystery wasn't just what was happening, but how it was happening. The enemy wasn't just advancing. They were instilling a terror that paralyzed thought. "Keep your ears open, Finn. If the attack comes, it's going to be through that mill road," Caleb instructed. "And if you hear absolutely nothing, that's when you run the fastest, and tell me what you see." Finn nodded gravely, his cigarette smoke curling up and vanishing quickly up air. As the scout disappeared back into the trenches, Caleb returned to the metallic clink of his tools, the only sound. He knew his flamethrower was their only chance against the invisible terror approaching from the north, a weapon of fire designed to conquer the oppressive, chilling specter of silence. He had to ensure that when it finally screamed, it would be a scream heard for miles, a defiant roar against the methodical, silent darkness that was enveloping the Hurtgen. The forest holds its secrets close, but the fire will reveal them. Don't miss the next chapter of Caleb's fight against the Silent Hunter. If you're invested in this story of survival, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the reveal of the Junkyard Flamethrower in action. Caleb spent the next hour working with a feverish intensity that pushed back the gnawing cold and the rising. The mystery of the Silent Hunter unit had taken root. He was a practical man, a mechanic. He needed a practical explanation for the impossibilities Finn had reported. Floating footprints, untouched, perfect silence. The human mind, especially under fire, was prone to distortion, yet Finn was reliable. He knew what he saw, or rather, what he didn't. He focused on the fuel. The standard M2 fuel was napalm, a sticky, gasoline-thickening agent that ensured the fire adhered to the target. But standard napalm, especially in this cold, produced a relatively short, orange flame. Caleb needed reach and heat. He had scavenged a small canister of magnesium powder from a crashed flare canister and a few liters of an experimental thickening agent meant for heavy vehicle lubrication, a petroleum derivative far more volatile than standard napalm. He began the dangerous process of mixing the chemicals in an empty jerry can outside the dugout, working quickly under the low, brooding sky. The wind shifted, bringing the distinct smell of wood smoke, not pine but acrid smoke, the signature of burning military rations and wet charcoal. German bivouac. They were close. Private Miller, a young, nervous machine gunner who manned the central bunker, peered over the sandbag. "Sarge, what in hell is that smell? The enemy getting ready for breakfast." "Relax, just mixing some specialty fuel," Caleb lied smoothly, not wanting to share the details of his volatile concoction. He added a small amount of the magnesium powder to the thickened gasoline mixture, knowing the danger. Magnesium would ensure the flame was brilliant white and burned at an exponentially higher temperature, capable of flash-igniting wet wood and metal. But it also made the mixture highly unstable. One bad bump, one stray spark, and the whole dugout could become a crater. As he worked the pump to pressurize the Junkyard tank, his mind drifted back to the rifle found leaning against the stump. It was the crucial. Soldiers do not abandon loaded rifles, not in the Hurtgen, unless they were forced to lay them down, forced not by violence, but by a sudden, paralyzing threat. Caleb hypothesized, what if the silence wasn't achieved through superhuman stealth, but through a calculated, overwhelming psychological shock? What if the Sonderkommando used not just conventional weapons, but a terrifying application of an existing technology, rendered hyper-effective by the forest's claustrophobic atmosphere and the Americans' exhaustion? He looked at the brass igniter mechanism he had taken from the German Flammenwerfer 35. It was a beautifully intricate piece of engineering. The official American doctrine dismissed German flamethrowers as bulky and short-ranged. But Caleb knew better. Their engineering was he suddenly remembered a report he'd just months ago. Rumors of a German unit specialized non-lethal irritant gases designed not to kill, but to incapacitate and disorient instant, leaving victims unharmed but compliant. A gas so subtle, so fast-acting, that a soldier would drop his weapon not to fight, but to gasp for air or rub his burning eyes. The silence, then, would be the result of a swift, invisible incapacitation, followed by the silent removal of the patrol by the Sonderkommando. The clean footprints, perhaps they wore large, specially padded snowshoes to distribute weight, or simply walked exactly in each other's steps. A trained unit performing perfect tactical. The untouched rifle was a mocking signature. That's the mystery. Sweat beading on his brow despite the... Not a ghost, but a highly trained unit using a tactical weapon we don't know how to counter. He finished pressurizing the tank, the gauge needle trembling at a red line he had drawn himself. It was a pressure rating the official M2 manuals warned against. The hose hissed, taut with compressed nitrogen and the volatile, white-hot fuel. He attached the modified nozzle, narrower, longer, salvaged from an old acetylene torch, to the wand. The weapon was a Frankenstein, dangerous to friend and foe alike, but it was the only thing that could counter an invisible enemy. A sudden sharp sound, not a gunshot, but the clean, deliberate snap of a dry branch breaking, came from the direction of the timber mill. It was the first unnatural sound in the creeping quiet. Caleb grabbed the heavy pack of the flamethrower, slung it onto his shoulders, and hoisted the wand. The weight settled, heavy and cold. Miller, on full alert. "Anything moves in that wood line, I don't care if it's a deer, you fire!" Caleb yelled, scrambling out of the dugout, the metallic tank scraping against the sandbag reinforced. He moved to the front trench line, peering out into the twilight-drenched. The silence had heavier, broken only by the frantic thump-thump of his own heartbeat. The snap of the branch was a deliberate signal. He looked at the forest, a wall of dark green and black shadows, waiting to swallow them whole. He had to assume his theory was correct. He needed to flush the hidden enemy out of the shadows, to force them to react with fire, not silence. The junkyard flamethrower was... The air was so still it felt pressurized, like the chamber of a forgotten tomb. Caleb, kneeling at the lip of the trench, his knuckles white around the flamethrower's wand, could hear the shallow, terrified breathing of the men around him. Miller's machine gun was silent, pointed uselessly into the impenetrable gloom. The deliberate snap of the branch still echoed ecological between the trees. "They're in the woods, Sarge." "Close," whispered Sergeant Reyes, the squad leader, his voice tight with controlled fear. "We've got movement at 3 o'clock. But it's too spread out. Not like a charge." Caleb narrowed his eyes, peering through the slight residual mist. He scanned the dense line of fir trees bordering the clearing about 60 yards ahead. Nothing. No silhouettes. No flashes of uniform. No sound of rustling gear. If his theory about the incapacitating gas was correct, they wouldn't use flares or smoke. It would betray their method. They would rely on the element of surprise, delivering the agent, and then moving in for the silent capture. They need to get close, Caleb. The gas, whatever its nature, would disperse quickly in the open. The silent hunter unit needed to reach the trenches before deploying it. Suddenly, a shift in the air, a subtle, almost imperceptible scent, not of wood smoke or powder, but of something metallically sweet, like burnt sugar. It was instantly masked by the damp pine scent, but Caleb had caught it, the irritant agent. They were starting the deployment, not with grenades, but with small, aerosolized bursts, using the low ground fog to carry the toxin. "Gas! Get your masks on! Now!" Caleb roared, fumbling with his own cumbersome M5 gas mask, while struggling to keep the flamethrower wand steady. The moment the mask was secured, the silence was replaced by the muffled echo of his own labored breathing. The men around him scrambled, the clack, clack, clack of their masks snapping into place, sounding deafening in the suddenly constrained world. But the few precious seconds of delay were critical. Through the distorted view of his mask's eyepieces, Caleb saw the shapes materialize. They weren't floating. They were simply moving with an astonishing, synchronized discipline. 6 figures, dressed in snow-camouflaged parkas that blended perfectly with the patches of white ground fog and the wet bar, advanced from the tree line. Their movements were low, fluid, and incredibly fast. They wore custom-fitted, dark, typical German gas, and were armed not with rifles, but with what looked like short-barreled MP-40 submachine guns and strange, canister-like device strapped to the silent hunters. The Sonderkommando weren't supernatural. They were simply better equipped, better trained, and using a chemical weapon as a strategic tool. One of the figures raised a wrist-mounted canister and aimed it toward Reyes's position. It wasn't a grenade. It was an aerosol sprayer. Caleb knew that once that cloud hit the open trench, the few men who hadn't gotten their masks on, or whose masks a tiny leak, would be instantly compromised. The assault would become a harvest. Caleb had no time to aim, no time for precision. He had to disrupt the entire advance, not just one man. He braced himself, pulling the firing lever and simultaneously twisting the main valve. The system groaned under the pressure, the modified nozzle struggling to contain the force. Instead of the M2's standard orange plume, a brilliant, terrifying column of white-hot pressurized flame erupted from the wand. The addition of the magnesium and the extreme pressure worked. The fire jet soared past the advertised limits, reaching almost 80 yards, a screaming, roaring torrent that cut a blinding arc through the forest gloom. The noise alone was paralyzed. The absolute silence was shattered by a mechanical, searing roar that sounded like 1,000 jet engines combined. The white flame was so intense it seemed to eat the darkness. It didn't hit the lead German soldier directly, but rather the 3 fir trees immediately behind him. The combination of hypervolatile fuel and magnesium instantly vaporized the residual moisture, and flash ignited the thick bark. Within 1 second, a triangular wall of superheated, roaring fire stood between the German line and the trench. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The German formation, disciplined and cold until that moment, broke. The 3 men nearest the trees were enveloped in the scorching thermal shockwave, their specialized parkas useless against the white heat. 2 of the remaining 3 turned to run, but the leader, a tall, gaunt man, paused. He raised his MP-40 and fired a short, frantic burst into the massive flamethrower tank strapped to Caleb's back. The bullets struck the thick steel tank, but the pressure and the volatile contents did not immediately detonate. Instead, the force of the impact ruptured a connection near the pressure regulator, sending a hissing jet of raw, unignited fuel streaming past Caleb's ear. The smell of the sweet metallic solvent was overwhelming, even through the mask. Caleb did. He adjusted the valve, cutting the main flow just enough, and swung the screaming torrent of fire toward the German leader. The stream of incandescent liquid connected with the man's torso. There was no sound of a scream, only the wet, terrible hiss of fire against fabric and flesh, and the sudden, complete vaporization of the specialized aerosol canister on his wrist. The German leader collapsed instantly, a shadow consumed by the unnatural white flame. The remaining 2 Sonderkommando vanished back into the woods, their stealth broken, their silence incinerated. Caleb released the lever. The trench was filled with the acrid chemical smell of superheated steel and napalm. Silence returned, but this time it was the bewildered, ringing silence of shock, not fear. The forest was alight with 3 huge roaring torches, the fir trees burning with an intensity no normal fire could produce. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Reyes finally yelled, his voice hoarse. He ripped off his mask, his eyes wide, looking at Caleb. "What in God's name was that, Sergeant? You just stopped an entire assault with a lighter." Caleb, his heart hammering against his ribs, his shoulders aching from the weight of the tank, lowered the wand. He looked down at the ruptured regulator, leaking precious fuel onto the mud, and then at the burning forest. The silent hunter was unmasked, but the cost had been dangerously high. His junkyard miracle had worked, but it was now damaged, and the fear was only temporarily subdued. The enemy knew their hand had been played, and they would return. The pre-dawn light filtered through the smoke-choked canopy, painting the forest in hues of bruised purple and gray. The 3 blazing fir trees now collapsed to pillars, incandescent charcoal casting dancing shadows the trench line. The immediate danger had, but the air was heavy with adrenaline and the acrid stench of Caleb's volatile fuel. Reyes had the men organized, extinguishing small flare-up, distributing dry wrap, all the while eyeing his damaged weapon with a mix of awe. "You didn't tell us about the magnesium scrap," Reyes said, leaning against the dugout entrance, his face grim. "You know that stuff turns a flamethrower into a walking bomb. If that Kraut bullet had been 2 inches lower, we'd all be charcoal dust. It was necessary, Sergeant, Caleb argued, voice flat. He was already working on the ruptured fuel line, using a specialized heat-resistant epoxy patch he usually reserved for engine blocks. Standard Flame wouldn't have had the throw or the heat to break their line or incinerate their gas. They were using a chemical advantage against us, I countered with a chemical one. But his pragmatism was fighting a rising tide of guilt. The reality of the carnage, the one German soldier reduced to a burnt silhouette, was heavier than the technical success. Caleb was a mechanic, a problem solver, not a frontline killer. He had just inflicted a horror that made the conventional firefights seem almost clean. Finn, his anxiety replaced by a hollow shock, approached the dugout. "We checked the bodies, Sarge, and the mill road. You were right about the gas. We found 2 canisters next to the burnt guy. Custom German issue, not standard Wehrmacht. And Reyes found these." Finn placed 3 objects on Caleb's workbench, a pair of custom-made thickly padded gaiters, almost like snowshoe bottoms made of dense felt and leather, and a single meticulously folded map of the American defensive position. Caleb picked up the gaiters. They were designed to distribute weight over soft, wet ground, minimizing pressure point. That explained the floating footprints, a specialized tool for stealth movement in the variable terrain of the Hurtgen. Practical, not ghostly. But it was the map, his attention. It wasn't a general map. It was detailed, with the precise location of the machine gun bunker, the mortar pit, and, crucially, a red circle around Caleb's dugout, labeled in precise German script, Waffenmechaniker, weapons. They knew your position, Scrap, race low. They weren't just attacking, they were targeting you. Why? This was the new layer of the mystery, a personalized one. Why would an elite German Sonderkommando focused on destabilizing a crucial sector dedicate a squad to eliminating a mere sergeant ordnance specialist? Caleb was good, not that important. Caleb stared at them. His mind raced over the past. He had repaired a communications array that had been crucial in calling in an accurate artillery strike last week. He had jury-rigged a demolition charge, destroyed a Panzer 2 days ago. Individual, small successes, but nothing strategically vital. Unless they knew this, Caleb whispered, tapping the damaged flamethrower. They didn't target the mechanic. They targeted the innovator. They knew about, or at least the potential for an improvised countermeasure. But how? No one outside his immediate squad had seen the full extent of his Junkyard flamethrower until moments ago. There had been no radio chatter, no documents shared. The only way the Germans could have known about a highly specific improvised weapon, a weapon was still just of scraps a few hours ago, was if they had a mole, an informant, or a listening post inside their immediate defensive perimeter. Caleb's eyes instinctively swept the tired, shaken faces of the men. Finn, Reyes, Miller, all looked exhausted, terrified, and loyal. Yet the evidence was chillingly clear. The Silent Hunter was not just a German unit, it was a trap set with specific internal knowledge. He felt the cold reality of betrayal settle over him, a psychological punch more devastating than any physical threat. The enemy knew his mind. The terrifying implication was that the Sonderkommando had not just withdrawn, they had retreated to their listening post, waiting for the next vulnerability, the next move. He pushed the thought down. He had to assume the enemy was everywhere and trust no information but his own observation. He finished patching the ruptured line, the epoxy hardening quickly in the cold air. "Reyes," Caleb said, standing up, the heavy flamethrower pack settling back. "We're moving the main position in 2 hours. Tell the men it's a defensive rotation, but we're not rotating. We're drawing the hunter out. If they're listening, they'll hear the chatter about the rotation. They'll move to intercept the new position." He looked at the forest, now illuminated by the rising sun, no longer spectral, but simply deadly. "And I need you, Finn, to go back to that old timber mill, not with a rifle, but with a radio and a piece of bait." The mystery had shifted from what they were to who among the American lines was feeding them, and Caleb's modified flamethrower, the very weapon they sought to eliminate, would now be the lure. The rotation began with predictable friction. Miller complained loudly about moving his heavy machine gun. Reyes issued deliberately misleading instructions about the supply drop zone. Every word, Caleb knew, was potentially being filtered through the enemy's intelligence apparatus. confirming their new strategic objective. Caleb's own new position was a small, isolated outcrop of rock 20 yards outside the main trenches, overlooking a narrow deer path, a high-risk, high-reward ambush. Meanwhile, Finn, a perpetually nervous scout, executed his terrifying mission. He carried a bulky, non-functional field radio, the bait, and the single, damning German map with the circle around the Waffenmechaniker position. His instructions were simple: hide the radio and map near the abandoned timber mill, creating a false point of interest, and then observe the area from a covered position, looking for any movement, any sign of an unnatural presence, or, more crucially, any sign of their own men. Caleb waited on the rocky outcrop, the Junkyard flamethrower ready. He had refilled the tank, carefully mixing the volatile fuel and repressurizing it to the breaking point. The sun was fully up now, but the Hurtgen was a place where light only revealed the obstacles, not the enemy. An hour passed. The main trenches looked empty, but Reyes and the rest of the squad were hidden 20 yards behind Caleb, their M1 rifles loaded, waiting for the inevitable counterattack. Then a flicker of movement near the timber mill about 200 yards away. Caleb raised his binoculars. Two figures, still in snow camo, emerged cautiously, one carrying what looked like a tripod and a directional listening device. The Sonderkommando had come to assess the new rotation and re-establish their eavesdropping position, but they weren't alone. As the two German figures knelt to set up their equipment, a third figure emerged from the deep shadows of the mill's ruined foundation, a figure in a mud-caked American uniform. It was Private First Class Jenkins, a radio operator from a neighboring company, a quiet man who was often sent to deliver coded messages. Caleb's heart dropped, a cold, sickening lurch in his stomach. Betrayal confirmed. Jenkins had been the invisible link, delivering information, or worse, leaving bugs and retrieving equipment under the guise of official duty. His knowledge of the supply and communications network was precisely why the Sonderkommando could anticipate American moves and pinpoint a specialized asset. As Jenkins conversed briefly with the two Germans pointing towards the abandoned American trenches, Finn's voice, raw with controlled urgency, crackled over Caleb's personal field radio headset. "Sarge, it's Jenkins. He's with them. I saw him deliver a packet last. Thought it was ration. It was their gas canister. The hunter had been baited and the mole exposed, but Caleb knew he had to act now. They couldn't allow Jenkins to get back to the lines, and they couldn't allow the Sonderkommando to confirm the emptiness of the main trench. Caleb stood up on the outcrop, making himself a highly visible yet intimidating target. The weight of the flamethrower was immense, but the weight of the moment was heavier. "Hey, Miller, fire!" Caleb yelled into his radio, a command designed to make the enemy believe the main position was manned and attacking. At the sound of the machine gun's sudden burst, fired by Reyes into a distant empty patch of woods, the three men at the mill scattered. The two Germans dove behind the ruins. Jenkins, frozen by the sound of the machine gun and the sound of Caleb's voice, started to run back towards the American lines. Caleb brought the heavy wand up, ignoring the intense vibrations from the overpressurized system. He didn't want to kill Jenkins, but he couldn't let him escape. He aimed not at the men, but at the mill structure, the place where the Sonderkommando would be hiding and storing their valuable equipment. He triggered the weapon. The white-hot furnace of the Junkyard flamethrower screamed to life again. This time, the jet of fire was not just a stream, but a concentrated, pressurized blast of incendiary material. It struck the wooden structure of the mill with devastating force. The dry, chemical-soaked wood, perfectly located the center of the enemy's operational base, instantly erupted in a blinding, terrifying inferno. The heat was so immense, it warped the corrugated iron roof of the building in seconds. The directional listening device, the specialized uniforms, and, critically, their store of irritant gas canisters were consumed in the unnatural magnesium-fueled firestorm. The two German Sonderkommando were not killed by the flame, but by the chain reaction. The concentrated heat from Caleb's flame flash ignited a pocket of their specialized fuel, or perhaps detonated the remaining irritant canisters, causing a massive secondary explosion that collapsed the stone chimney and sent shrapnel flying. The silent hunters had been consumed by their own fire Jenkins, only 50 yards away, dropped to his knees, paralyzed by the sight and the sound. The mystery was over. The terror was defeated, not by bravery alone, but by a mechanical genius who saw past the fear to the underlying technical problem. Caleb lowered the smoking wand, his shoulders trembling with exhaustion. He had created a weapon that countered a psychological threat with a physical, blinding spectacle, defeating stealth with the rawest form of aggression. The Junkyard Flamethrower had, in seconds, turned back an elite assault by destroying the enemy's secret weapon and their source of information. The forest was silent again, but this time the silence was one of victory and finality. Reyes and Finn emerged from cover, running toward the outcrop. Caleb didn't wait for them. He knew his job was done. The truth, like the fire, had been revealed. This is the end of Sergeant Caleb Hayes' incredible story of survival, ingenuity, and the fight against invisible fear in the Hurtgen Forest. If this tale of suspense, mystery, and growth captivated, don't let the fire go out. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more real-life-inspired Baruway adventures.